All right. So statements. Statements are the building blocks of arguments. There cannot be an argument without statements, really, without at least two statements, at least one statement serving as the premise and one as the conclusion. And we can sort of, just intuitively work out just why statements need to be there in arguments, why they are so crucial. Because when we argue, uh, when we reason, we're trying to establish the truth of something. We're trying to characterize in some way or another the world and argue that our characterization is correct. So if we're not saying anything about the world, then we really can't be said to be arguing. But of course, statements in themselves, or the presence of statements in itself, is not a sufficient condition for something being an argument. We can have statements which are claims about the world without having an argument. Here's an example, just off the top of my head. The day was rainy and gray. All the people looked drab, and the mood was somber. Jim looked at his watch and worried about his appointment with his boss. That's filled with statements. All of those sentences contained at least one statement. There's many statements there, but it's not an argument. Uh, it is not it does not constitute reasoning. They're just claims about the world, and there's no attempt there to prove any, to justify any, to offer any support for any of the statements. And really, I think the best way to characterize why this text here is not an argument is that there's a complete absence of inference. There's no claim that because one thing is true, another thing must be true. So if you look at a piece of writing and you find no inferences, you can be sure that it's not an argument. Uh, Now, oftentimes we rely on what we can call reasoning indicators or inference indicators. That is, words or expressions in language that actually indicate that reasoning is occurring or that an inference is being made. There are conclusion indicators and there are premise indicators. I'll put up a link. There's a million things like this on the internet, but I'll put up a link to this page, which just gives a list of a fairly exhaustive one, actually. I mean, more complete than you would ever really need, of premise indicators and conclusion indicators, and actually other parts of language which may appear or seem like they should be inference indicators, reasoning indicators, but are not. But there are words and expressions in language that tell us, that make explicit, that put right out front that reasoning is going on. And some of those words indicate that what follows is a premise, and some indicate that what follows is a conclusion. Like because, which sometimes is and sometimes isn't a premise indicator. But clearly here, because you have no money, you should get a job, is an indicator, the word because, that this statement here is a reason for believing this statement here. And in fact, this constitutes a little argument. You have no money is the premise. You should get a job is the conclusion. We could put the very same argument in a different way. You have no money, so you should get a job. In this case, so is it's an inference indicator, but it's a conclusion indicator. That is, it indicates that what follows, you should get a job, is a conclusion based upon here, this as a premise. So, one of the things that we'll be doing is outlining arguments, paring down arguments to their essentials, so that we see that this argument here and this argument here are the same argument. Because if we put them in so-called standard form, where we write out all the premises and the conclusion, we get the same thing. There's one premise here and there's one conclusion. So again, I'll put this link up. You can look, you can see the premise indicators, as, since, for, because, and then a million expressions. Conclusion and indicators like therefore, which is like the best in a way. Conclusion, indicator, consequently, hence, as a result. I mean, these are things that we sort of, if you're fluent in English, you just simply take for granted and don't really even see when you're reading. But say something like since, because you have no money, you should get a job. We could just replace because with since, right? So conclusion indicator, or excuse me, inference indicators, which are really just reasoning indicators, are very helpful in reading. When we're trying to establish just what the argument is, we should be looking for those inference indicators, both conclusion indicators and premise indicators. And I'll be giving you some exercises this week, just to practice that or get in the habit of looking for such things. But it's very important to keep in mind that they're not always there. Inference indicators are helpful, but they're not necessary, and you don't have to have one present in order to have an argument. Now, I'm not saying this is a good argument, but this is an argument. Jim is the worst student in the class. He never studies and shows no interest in schoolwork of any kind. He spends most of his time playing video games and working on his car. It would be a bad idea for him to go to college. Now, first of all sorts of claims about the world, all sorts of statements or propositions, which is good, okay. Good sign that it may be an argument. But of course, the presence of statements is not sufficient. It's necessary for an argument, but it's not sufficient. An argument has to have reasoning, and we ask ourselves, is there reasoning here? And yes, there clearly is reasoning. I mean, there's no inference indicator. There's no since, there's no because, there's no therefore, there's no so, there's no hence, there's no as a result. All sorts of words and expressions that make explicit the fact that we're reasoning, but there's implied reasoning. I mean, it's clearly an argument. So really, part of the skill in any language that we're fluent in is picking these things up. Clearly, everything here is premises. These are all reasons for believing what is the conclusion, which is this, that it would be a bad idea for him to go to college. And what we'll be working on a lot this week is identifying premises and the conclusion in arguments.